Okay, now let's talk about the voice leading of added notes. How do we get there? How do we leave them? We've already mentioned in the first class that voice leading is essential to any kind of harmony making sense because the ear has to know where a note is coming from and where it's going. Otherwise, it just sounds like a wrong note. So there are various ways of voice leading added notes. We'll see several of them in our examples. The simplest one would be the one we already saw in example 1, where at the end of the example, the note on the top, the G, is the note that becomes the added note. So we could say it's like it's prepared. Okay? It's treated like a suspension, but it's never resolved. So there is a preparation, but there's no resolution. You can also have the added note arriving by step. That's if you look at the second bar of example 2. Notice that in the middle part, if I start at the beginning of bar 2, it's G, F, E. So the E arrives by step. It's not held over, but it's by step. So the ear is not shocked by that note. Just as an example, look what happens if I leap. Much stronger accent because it's not led by the voicing in any coherent way. So that'd be a much more striking progression in that case. That's not impossible, but it would be used in a very different kind of situation, musically speaking. And then finally, you can also leap, as we saw in example 4. So that G is not prepared and it's not resolved, comes by leap. This is a fairly gentle added note. It creates a major second with the note in the chord, not a minor second, but still, it gives a certain accent. An unprepared dissonance like that will always add more accent or more emphasis to the chord than a prepared one will. But again, it's quite appropriate in this context. You'll often see added note chords in jazz. The unusual thing about jazz is that they'll often be used parallel. Parallel movements like that, what they do in effect is they certainly don't give you stepwise voice leading necessarily, but they keep the level of tension the same. So the chords are added notes because they never resolve, like this normally would resolve to that, but if I go, none of those notes ever resolves, but the level of tension is the same, so it's kind of normal in that situation. As we mentioned before, the really important thing about added notes, however, is they are not resolved functionally. Again, if I were to take example 4, if I resolved all the dissonances in the normal way, I would be doing this. Etc. But that's not an added note anymore. That's a plain old appoggiatura. And again, I emphasize that the same chord can result from different processes. So it's really the context that's going to determine it. And in fact, in coming lessons, we're going to see some of these same chords coming in other contexts. And really, the point is, as long as they sound coherent in context, there's no problem. Now let's talk about the spacing of added notes. Since added notes by definition are dissonances, we have to think a little bit of how we space them in the texture. As a general principle, the more dissonance follows the overtone series, the less noticeable it is. So here's an example of a C major chord. Look at the spacing. You can see that that barely sounds like a dissonance. That's, however, the same chord I just did that way. Notice when it's bunched together, it's much stronger. So like I said, the more you put the dissonances far away on the top, in the top register, the less dissonant they generally sound. Here's example 6. This is how we work it out. In example 6, I have a C major chord with an added D flat. In the first one, the C major chord is on the bottom and the added note is on top. So we get, well, that's a little bit crunchy because it's a strong dissonance, okay? It's a D flat and a C. Not too bad. Now watch what happens is I move that D flat down an octave. A little bit more colorful. It's getting stronger. Now I'll move it again down an octave. Notice how much heavier it gets down here? And then the last one with the D flat on the bottom sounds much more dissonant because now the bass seems to disagree with the notes on top. So you could say that these are all different versions of the same chord, but their effect is enormously different. That also touches a general principle we're going to be coming back to again and again, which is that the more complex the harmony, the more you have to talk about the spacing and the orchestration. It's acceptable to talk about this those 3 chords as being the same chord inverted. When you start talking about a chord with 6 notes, the idea of inversion doesn't mean much anymore because it depends so much on the spacing. We'll be coming back to that point. Anyway, in example 6, we can see how just the placement of the added note in register in relation to the rest of the chord makes a big difference in how clear or how heavy it's going to sound. On the opposite side, let's look at example 7. Here we have an example in the last chord of an added note, added a separate octave on top. First chord, and then that added sixth on top is extremely gentle, both because it's a major second with the B, which is the note it's dissonant with, but also because it's far away. Again, if I just change the register, it's not enormously heavy, but it's much heavier than that. So again, the spacing is really, really important to get the sense of an added note and to the heaviness or lightness that you want to give it. Both are acceptable. You could be using both, but you have to decide which one is the one you need for the given context.